Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Your Head in Mind podcast, where we dive deep into all things mental health. I'm your host, Kyle, and today's episode promises to shed some light on something essential, yet often overlooked: sleep. Joining me is Dr. Stephen Lockley, a renowned expert in sleep science and circadian rhythms who has worked with NASA astronauts and Formula One drivers to help optimize their performance through better sleep. Together, we'll explore why sleep is so much more than just a time to rest. It's fundamental for brain function, memory, and even our emotional resilience. Dr. Lockley will also unravel common myths about sleep needs, explain how light therapy can improve sleep, and share practical tips to boost your sleep quality. Whether you're struggling with sleep, curious about its connection to mental health, or just want to learn ways to optimize your energy and focus, this episode has something for you. I'm Kyle, and this is the Your Head in Mind podcast. Let's dive in. Thank you for coming onto the podcast, Stephen. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I'm just going to start off with a very general question of what exactly is sleep in your opinion?
Well, it's a great question and something that researchers have been trying to find out for many millennia. We don't really know what sleep is, except to say that it represents a change of consciousness, a change of how we interact with the outside world. And so in humans, we measure sleep by looking at brain activity patterns in a lab where we can look at the changes in the brain overnight, sleep being a very active process. But in other species, for example, in insects, we look at changes in insect behavior. So flies sleep, cockroaches sleep, and they change, for example, their body position, they change where their antennae are positioned, and they have, similar to humans, a change in their arousal threshold. So it's harder to sort of wake them up and do things when they're in their sleep state versus in their rest state. So all species, we think, sleep to some extent or have a type of rest and recovery. But how we measure that really depends on the species we're measuring. But all of them are around rest and recovery, I think, as being one of the main roles of sleep.
Okay, so in your book, which is a very short introduction to sleep, you say that sleep is an essential behavior and it's as important as nutrition for our survival. So what is the reason that we need to sleep?
Again, we don't really know, if we're honest.
Yeah.
We just know that if we don't sleep, things can go downhill very quickly. And so there have been various theories about why we sleep and what sleep is doing for us. One of the more recent suggestions is that sleep is helping to clean out the brain. So during the day, we build up through our cellular activities, we build up waste material in our cells. And what happens then at night while we're asleep is we get rid of that waste material. We clean out the brain. And so the idea that any inability to clear out the brain, for example, if you don't sleep very well, increases the risk potentially of neurological disorders. And so there have been links, for example, between short sleep and dementia through this particular pathway. So we think that sleep is helping to clean out the brain and recover the brain activity. We know that the brain is helping during sleep to recover the body. Many things are released at night that help with muscle recovery, for example, things like growth hormone, testosterone, and so on. So there's an element of recovery and restoration during sleep. We've known for quite a while now that sleep is required for memory formation and for learning. And so after you learn something in the daytime, after you've taken in all that experience while you're awake, the brain then files it away during sleep, remembers the things you need to remember, and gets rid of the things you don't. And sleep seems to be a crucial component of that memory formation. And in fact, different types of sleep are thought to be involved in different types of memory consolidation. And so sleep and memory is thought to be a very key role. We used to think that sleep was involved in some sort of energy regulation or energy savings, but that probably isn't the case anymore. It really is the idea that the brain is being restored by sleep. This cleaning out of the brain, is one of the more recent ideas of the importance of sleep.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm absolutely fascinated by sleep because you talk about it in your book about it's one thing that's can be seen replicated across the animal kingdom, and at the end of the day, it's detrimental for survival because you're in a state which you're harder to be aroused, you're more susceptible to predation. So I think it must be have such great importance if we're still sleeping now.
Correct. It is an unusual situation for an organism to put itself in, where it's not interacting with the world. As you said, it's open to predation. It's not looking for food. It's not looking for a mate. So it really must be essential. And in terms of comparing it to nutrition, studies have shown that, in fact, you would survive longer with starvation than you would with sleep deprivation. And even in the fairly short term, people can feel the impact of a lack of sleep. So if you don't sleep for a few days, which sometimes people don't do, you quite quickly go downhill after that. It's not that you can't sleep for weeks at a time. It's just impossible to do that. And even after a few days of sleep deprivation, our abilities to function, particularly, the ability of our brain to function, is impaired. And in animal studies where animals have been kept awake to understand the processes, what happens eventually with sleep deprivation is organ failure across all organs. The entire body and brain really starts to break down. And so it truly is an essential behavior. If we don't sleep, we don't survive. And because it's so well preserved, obviously it's forming a very important part of our biology.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about how important it is because reflecting on my own personal experience of having troubles with sleep, it really does affect you both physically and mentally. Or when I've had a lack of sleep, or for a couple of days, or stayed up late, I just feel awful, and it's mirrored by my cognitive abilities.
Yeah, that's the case. And that's sort of the short-term impact that people feel very easily. If you don't sleep well, you quite quickly feel bad. But for people who sleep perfectly fine, they sort of take for granted what sleep is doing for them. If you sleep well, then you don't really think about it. You just get on with your life and things are okay. But if you then start to struggle with sleep, you notice it. You notice it in your affect. You notice it in how you feel internally. You notice how you interact with other people. Obviously, people are often more irritable or quicker to anger if they're not slept very well. And then if that continues over potentially days, weeks, months, years, we know that this has long-term health effects as well. And so sleep is helping our short-term cognitive function, making sure we're awake and alert and can do what we need to do day to day, but is also serving long-term health. If we don't sleep well over a lifetime, we know that many disorders and diseases have an increased risk of occurring.
Yeah, that's interesting. The effects on, obviously, long-term effects, because I guess that's a lot of things with people in general is focused on the short term, but without really reflecting on the long-term implications. So how much sleep do we actually really need, and does it vary between different individuals? Because some people, say they can operate on little to no sleep.
Well, we all need probably more sleep than we get. I think that's a fair statement. There are some individual differences between sleep need, but they're nothing like as large as people claim. We should be getting at least 7 hours a night minimum, and hopefully more than that, somewhere between 7 and 9. And in fact, the recommended minimum for adults is 7 hours a night each and every night. And we'll come back to the impact of sleep loss a little later. So 7 hours is the minimum target. So that shouldn't be what you aim for. That you should try and get more than that. But we know that if you sleep less than that, there are impairments in cognitive function and these longer-term health problems, and that's pretty well established. So the idea that people do well on 5 or 6 hours a night is just incorrect. Now, they may feel they're doing okay, but in fact, we're not very good at judging our own sleepiness. And when you measure people objectively, they're actually performing quite poorly. but they think they're doing quite well. And so if people are successful, they think because they only sleep 5 or 6 hours a night, in my view, they're successful despite sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night. And if they slept longer, they would do better. There are many sort of high-performing individuals who can speak to that in terms of more sleep being important for their good performance. But in terms of need, say at least 7 hours a night in adults. In younger people, certainly teenagers need more than that, probably getting up towards sort of 8 to 10 hours a night, and maybe even more in younger children. A couple of different experiments were done to try and assess what people would get if they had no restriction. And so one study looked at 18 to 30-year-olds and put them in bed for 16 hours a night for about 2 weeks. So they went to bed at 4 p.m., and they weren't allowed to get out of bed, and they could do nothing else but sleep until 8 a.m. the next morning. And sleep was measured in those experiments. And for the first couple of nights, people slept quite a long time. They were recovering some of their sleep debt. So they might sleep 11, 12, 13 hours for a couple of days. But then after about a week or so, they reached a lower level of about 8.5 hours of sleep per night. So these were healthy young people, and they would sleep without any restriction about 8.5 hours on average. In older people, a different study, but looking at people over 60, they were given 12 hours in bed at night and a 4-hour nap in the day, and they slept eventually about 7.5 hours a night. And so these are, if you like, the sort of biological capacity for sleep that you would have without the real world getting in the way. And so we should be aiming for at least that in our daytime lives. And so 7 hours is a minimum, but ideally we should be getting more. And this really would apply to everyone.
So, as you say, there's some differences with age. Do you know why young children require so much sleep? Is that anything to do with, memory processing and the amount of information they're learning?
Yes, certainly. So babies, very young babies, have a lot of REM sleep compared to the amount of REM sleep we have as adults. So REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep, and that's a type of sleep we have in a cycle with another type of sleep called non-REM sleep. And these cycle through the night in adults every about 90 minutes, in children about every 60 minutes. And we go through these REM and non-REM cycles all through the night. And in general, you would tend to have more of the non-REM at the start of the night and more of the REM in the second half of the night. But these proportions change as we age. And so in younger children, certainly in babies, there's a lot more REM sleep than you would have as an adult. And that is thought to be because as a baby, as a young child, you're taking in so much information that needs to be learned that you need a lot of this REM sleep to form that memory, to take in all that information and save it in the brain. And then as we get older, the sleep cycles get a bit longer, and we tend to have less of the REM sleep, to where as adults we may have 20 to 25% of our sleep be REM, because we still need to learn and still need to have that function. And then as we get older and older into late adulthood, we find it harder probably to have more of the deep sleep that we have, which helps recover our alertness levels. And what changes as we age is that we can't maintain sleep for as long or maintain wake for as long. And so older adults tend to sleep a little bit less, or tend to have more daytime naps and more sleepiness in the daytime. And so we lose a little bit our ability to have long episodes of sleep and long episodes of wake. Having said that, in the study I mentioned earlier with the 7.5 hours of sleep in older people, they were very healthy older people. And so if you are a healthy elderly person, you should still be sleeping, reasonably well and quite normally. Many of the changes that we see in sleep with aging are not due to aging, but are due to diseases associated with aging, which in turn affects sleep. But yes, sleep is a very dynamic process, both overnight and also through our lifetimes, and does probably reflect the different functions of sleep as we age.
How can each of the stages be characterized, and what role do they have? Why are they different to each other? Why do we have these cycles of sleep?
So In humans, we measure sleep by putting electrodes on the scalp and measuring brain activity patterns. And over about the last century, these activity patterns have been described as different sleep stages. And there have been some changes over time in the exact definitions, but in general, non-REM sleep tends to be deeper sleep with bigger waves that you see in the brain activity pattern. And this is a type of sleep which seems to be more stable. So you have slower breathing rates, slower heart rates, more stable heart rates over these sleep stages. And the deep non-REM sleep tends to happen more in the first half of the night. And then REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep, if you ever watch someone sleeping during REM, you can see their eyes move under their eyelids. REM sleep is a much more active process in the brain, and in fact looks a lot like wake in the brain. The only difference between wake and REM sleep really is that you can't move during REM sleep. Your muscles are paralyzed sort of from the neck down, so you don't act out your dreams. And so REM sleep is very active. The brain looks like an awake brain. And this tends to happen in the second part of the night, but is controlled by the circadian clock, your 24-hour circadian clock. Now, the deep non-REM sleep tends to reflect how much recovery you feel when you wake up, how much sleepiness you've sort of gotten rid of overnight. And so if you have a lot of that deep non-REM sleep, you feel quite restored in the morning. If you don't have very much of that deep sleep, you will still feel tired. The REM sleep, we think, is more involved in the memory consolidation and memory formation. And you probably remember more of the dreams you have during REM sleep, although you're probably dreaming through the entire night. But sometimes we might miss out on REM if we wake up too early, for example. And so sometimes, people struggle with getting enough REM sleep if they're not in bed long enough and not sleeping long enough. But these sleep patterns cycle about every 90 minutes, where you go from shallow sleep to deep sleep to REM sleep, back to shallow sleep, about every 90 minutes or so. And so if you can schedule your wake time in a 90-minute increment, you may wake up feeling a little bit more alert. And so if you were to sleep for 7.5 or 9 hours, for example, and wake up at those durations, you may be waking up at top of the sleep cycle where you are sleeping more lightly, and you may feel a bit less groggy than if you're waking in the middle of one of those cycles from a deeper sleep, for example.
Yeah, that's a good insight because sometimes when I've woken up and you just feel so groggy and clumsy, whereas versus other times, I guess it's when you go for a nap and you have a short nap versus a long nap. Sometimes you wake up, you feel refreshed. Does that play into the kind of the cycles of sleep?
Yeah, a little bit. Although daytime napping is a bit unusual. We don't quite know why you get all the benefit you do from a short nap in the daytime. If you sleep for 20 minutes in the day, you can sometimes feel quite refreshed. That doesn't seem to be through the same mechanisms that we have at night. If you had a 20-minute sleep at night and woke up, you'd feel pretty groggy, I think. But certainly the grogginess that you have when you wake up, it's officially called sleep inertia. And it actually takes about 2 to 4 hours to get rid of when you wake up from a nighttime sleep to get fully alert. And things that can make it worse is if you've woken from a deep sleep, if you are quite chronically sleep deprived, sleep inertia tends to be worse, or if you wake from a low point in your circadian cycle. So if you wake up at 3, 4, 5 in the morning, you can often have worse sleep inertia because you're waking up at a low point in your rhythm. But no matter what time you wake up, it does take some time to become fully alert. And so you should try not to do things as soon as possible after waking. So, don't wake up and jump straight in the car, for example, because you're quite sleepy still.
Yeah, I guess that also plays into, when you speak to some people and they say, don't talk to me before I've had my morning coffee. Whereas I feel like that could be more relating to the sleep inertia rather than the caffeine, because you've just woken up, really. You shouldn't really need caffeine, right?
Correct. It just takes a while naturally for you to feel alert. And so the curve's actually sort of an exponential curve. So even after half an hour, you're feeling pretty good. An hour, a little bit better. 2 to 4 hours, you're at that full alertness level. The longer after sleep you wait before doing something, the better it is. But even that half an hour can make a big difference. So yes, it's you would have the sleep inertia even without the caffeine. And maybe we'll talk about caffeine a little bit later. You may actually be more alert without it, but maybe we'll get to
Okay. Yeah, interesting. So you touched on the circadian rhythm. So what is the circadian rhythm, and what role does it play in sleep?
Yeah, so we all have a circadian clock in our brains. Circadian means about a day. So a circadian rhythm is a rhythm which lasts about 24 hours. And one of those rhythms is the sleep-wake cycle. So your natural sleep-wake pattern lasts about a day, lasts about 24 hours. But there are many other things controlled by the clock. So many of your hormones are regulated by the clock. Your mood, your performance, your metabolism, your immune system, your reproductive hormones. Really, most parts of our biology are governed to some extent by this 24-hour clock. But in terms of sleep, the clock determines how sleepy you are, first of all, and then what type and duration of sleep you have. So from a sleepiness point of view, obviously you're more sleepy if you're awake at 3 in the morning than if you're awake at 3 in the afternoon. And that's the circadian clock driving sleepiness at night, because we've evolved as a diurnal animal to be asleep at night and awake in the daytime. And the circadian clock drives that pattern. So first of all, if you're awake at the wrong time, you'll be more sleepy because the clock's promoting sleep. And then when you sleep within the circadian cycle changes how long you can sleep and the quality of sleep. So if you try to sleep in the daytime, for example, if you're a shift worker and you've been awake all night and sleep in the day, you can't sleep as long in the daytime than you can at night. And that's because the circadian clock is trying to promote wakefulness in the daytime. It's trying to wake you up in the day. And similarly, you don't get quite the same sleep stages in the daytime. I mentioned before that REM sleep seems to be under control of the circadian clock. And so if you sleep at the wrong time, if you sleep in the daytime rather than the night, you're likely to have less REM sleep than the same duration of sleep at night. So the circadian clock controls many rhythms, and one of those is sleep, and it determines how much sleep, what type of sleep you get, and also your levels of sleepiness if you're awake.
Okay, so in your book, I've read about people who are blind, and they don't have their clock isn't quite aligned to the day and light cycle, right? So could you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes. So again, we all have this internal clock, but we're all set slightly differently from 24 hours. And so some of us might have a very quick clock, let's say 23 and a half hours. And some of us might have a slower clock, which might be as long as 25 hours. The average actually is 24 hours and 12 minutes, a little bit more than 24. The reason that's important is that clock is reset every day to 24 hours by the light-dark cycle. So if we were to go and live in a cave without any light, we would all run on our own time. Some of us would run on a 23 and a half hour day. Some of us would run on a 25-hour day. And it's the light-dark cycle that brings us all back to the 24-hour day that we live in when we live in a natural environment. Now, blind people can't do that. Totally blind people who don't have any light perception don't have that ability to reset their clocks to the 24-hour light-dark cycle every day. And so they run on their own internal time. And in fact, they develop quite a debilitating disorder called non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder, where their internal clock is running on a non-24-hour day. But of course, people try to live in a 24-hour world. And so people still need to go to school or go to work or have a social life on a 24-hour pattern. But because their internal clocks are on a non-24-hour day, then it creates this mismatch and it actually causes some quite serious problems. It's a little bit like being jet lagged all the time. And so if your body clock is at 24 and a half hours, which is the equivalent of half a time zone, it's like traveling half a time zone every day for the rest of your life, which can be very, very disruptive. And so we take for granted what light is doing for us in terms of synchronizing our rhythms and keeping us on a 24-hour day. But if you lose that ability, if you lose your eyes and can't detect the light, then you can no longer do that, and it causes this problem. We can actually treat it, though, with either melatonin or a drug called Hetlioz, which is a melatonin agonist, whereby giving the melatonin or the agonist every day, every 24 hours, we can provide a substitute time cue for blind people. So it is something that can be treated, but it does show the importance of light.
So just as a follow-up for some of our listeners who might not know, what is melatonin and what role does it play in sleep?
So melatonin is a natural hormone, and it's actually the hormone of darkness. It's not the hormone of sleep, where sometimes people think it's a sleep hormone. It tells the brain whether it's night or day. And so we release melatonin only at night. And in fact, we change the duration of melatonin with seasons. And so melatonin is also not just a signal to our circadian clock, but also to our circannual clock, our seasonal clock. And in the winter, we produce melatonin for a longer duration because the nights are longer. And then in the summer, we produce melatonin for shorter duration because the nights are shorter. And humans still have this capability. If you put humans in different light-dark cycles, the melatonin profile will change. But it's more important in seasonally breeding animals, for example, like sheep or ferrets or hamsters and so on. They use this change in the melatonin signal to trigger their breeding cycles at different times of year. So humans, we don't think humans really do that, but we still maintain this signal. So internally, melatonin signals to the brain that it's night, and then the brain does all the things it needs to do at night, such as send us to sleep and get more sleepy and change the hormone levels and so on. People shouldn't get confused with that natural melatonin, the natural hormone, and melatonin pills, which are synthetic versions of melatonin. And in the UK, they are available on a prescription basis and sometimes used to treat insomnia, although it's not a very good treatment for insomnia. Melatonin is not really a very good sleeping pill, but it has been approved for that in some individuals. And sometimes people get confused because they think melatonin has been given for sleep and therefore the natural hormone is for sleep. It's not quite like that. The melatonin in our brains is telling the brain it's night. Now, it's a good thing to try and maintain your melatonin profile at night because it is doing the right thing in the brain at the right time. But light suppresses melatonin. And so this is why we don't want people to be using their phones close to bedtime or seeing bright light exposure in the evening, because light directly suppresses your melatonin and tells the brain that it's still daytime. And if the brain thinks it's still daytime, it's going to keep you awake and keep you active and make it harder to fall asleep. And so that's why by reducing your light exposure in the evening and not using your phone before bed, you might find it easier to fall asleep because you would preserve the melatonin cycle, which tells the brain that it's nighttime, which then means go to sleep. And we can expand a bit more on lighting patterns a little later.
Yeah, it's interesting that, obviously if we didn't have all this artificial light around, we would just be subject to the light and dark cycles, and we would just be getting sleepy easily every night without having to set like limits on how much artificial light we get.
Correct. The sort of electric light we expose ourselves to does have a big impact on our circadian rhythms and on our sleep, even indoor room light. It doesn't need to be very bright to have an impact on our sleep. And so, after dusk, really any light is not natural. And so any light we see after dusk is telling the brain it's daytime, even though it's dark outside and we should really be trying to think about sleep. And so one thing that people can think about doing to help with their sleep is to reduce that light exposure in the evening. So that means turning lights off, for example. It means using a dimmer bulb if you have a table lamp. It means also trying to use a warmer looking bulb because it's blue light actually, which is most alerting to the brain. And so if you have a warmer looking, sort of red-orange looking bulb, that will make you more sleepy. Your phones and laptops and computers and TVs, unfortunately, pump out quite a lot of blue light. And so the closer you use those devices to bedtime, the worse it is for sleep. And in fact, light has a half-life, a little bit like caffeine. It keeps on alerting the brain for several hours, even after you switch the light off. So if you use your phone all the way up until bedtime and then go to sleep, you will have less deep sleep in the first 1 to 2 sleep cycles because that alerting effect of light carries over into sleep. So this is why we say to people, stop using your phone as long as possible before you can sleep. Be in dim light, ideally 2 to 3 hours before you plan to go to sleep, because that light is a stimulus and will trick the brain into thinking it's daytime and make it harder to fall asleep.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting, and we'll touch more on the artificial lighting later in the episode. So many famous figures, such as Mark Wahlberg, for example, promote themselves on having little to no sleep, and often there's a common rhetoric which is, "I'll sleep when I'm dead." And what is your perspective on this, Stephen? And what is the potential impact on people's health and performance?
Well, there's very little doubt that if you don't sleep as much as you can, it will have an impact on mortality. So you'll be able to sleep when you're dead a little sooner if you don't sleep very much. So it's well established that short sleep is usually defined as 6 hours or less a night, does increase mortality, does increase the risk of some cancers, diabetes, depression. More recently, it's shown to be increasing the risk of dementia and Parkinson's disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, high blood pressure. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so short sleep is a bad idea. And in fact, there are both the short and the long-term consequences we talked about earlier. Even in the short term, if you're only sleeping a few hours a night, you are more at risk of an accident or an injury. You're more at risk of having a drowsy driving accident. You're not going to perform at your best. And in the long term, you'll have an increased risk of all of these diseases and death. Now, there are individuals who say, well, I sleep very little and I'm brilliant and I do great and I feel fine. But part of the reason for that is that a sleepy brain can't judge how sleepy it is. And in fact, researchers have compared sleepiness to alcohol use and titrated the two. And if you've been awake for about 17 hours straight, you are performing at the level of a blood alcohol concentration of about 0.05%. If you have been awake for around 21 hours or more, then your performance is the same as someone with a blood alcohol of 0.08%, which is the legal driving. And so you're performing as if you're drunk in terms of your cognitive function if you've been awake for this sort of 17 to 24-hour period. Now, just like, though, having a drink, you may not make some of the best decisions you've ever made in your life having had a drink. You may overestimate your abilities and your performance. The same is true of sleepiness. A sleepy brain can't judge itself, and it in fact overestimates how poorly it's performing. And when we've done experiments on exactly this, where we've put people in the lab and given them chronically short sleep episodes and measured their objective performance, but then asked them about their subjective performance, they're getting worse and worse and worse objectively, but they think they're actually doing as well, or in fact getting better in their subjective sleepiness. And so, unfortunately, I think people who sleep a short amount of time and say that they're doing well just can't assess themselves, and in fact are unfortunately a little delusional in how well they're doing. And of course, there are many other famous figures who sleep a lot and promote sleep and say that sleep is very important to them. And you can think about, people like Tom Brady, American football star, Formula One drivers very much promote sleep. Einstein apparently was someone who valued sleep a great deal and slept a lot. And so it's really a false opinion to say I can do well on a short amount of sleep. You're doing yourself a lot of harm.
What are some other common misconceptions about sleep that you've come across during your career?
So earlier we talked a little bit about sleep stages, and sometimes there's the sort of the old wives' tale that an hour of sleep before midnight is worth 2 after. And this is the idea that if you can get that slow wave deep sleep at the start of the night, then that's really the most important part. And so that sort of idea was continued in the 1980s, where people talked about having a core sleep, and you only needed 4 or 5 hours of core sleep, and then you got everything you needed. That's not true. We've found more recently that you have to get that REM sleep later in the night. You have to have a longer sleep episode and get more of these different stages of sleep to get the full benefits of sleep. So the idea that that early core sleep is really the most important part just doesn't hold up anymore. Also, the sort of myth that you're somehow better if you get up early and are active earlier in the day. We are quite prejudiced against evening types, against people whose clocks are set later and who would like to sleep in, and we shouldn't be. And this concept of whether you're a morning person or an evening person is related to the biological clocks that I talked about earlier. The people who have a rapid clock, a quicker clock, who tend to feel better earlier in the day and wake up earlier in the day, they tend to be more morning type and have this sort of 23.5 to 24-hour clock. Those of us who have a longer clock, say 24.5 to 25 hours, tend to be more evening type and wake up later in the day, feel better, and later in the day do their best work later in the day. But society sort of imposes a morningness on us that we have to get up and be in work by 7 o'clock, or you've got to get up and go to school early. And then your parents tell you, well, you're missing the best part of the day, and try and kick you out of the bed at weekends because they think you're lazy because you're trying to sleep in and recover. And so we really need to get away from this prejudice against evening types, because it is genetically set. It is due to this biological clock, and making young people get up early in the morning is detrimental to their sleep. They can't sleep enough. They won't get enough of the sleep stages required. And we know that, it has effects on things like learning and health. For example, there's been a push to have a later school start times for teenagers. Teenagers tend to have a biological clock which is set later than adults. So making a 15-year-old get up at 7 a.m. is like making me get up at 4 a.m. And I'm not at my best then. And so there has been a push to move school start times later for teenagers, and places where that's been done, grades go up, absences go down, sickness goes down, people are healthier and learn better if they're allowed to come to school later because of this change in the biological clock. Similarly with workplace flexi time, if you're an evening person and want to come to work later and leave later, you should be allowed to do that, because that fits better with your rhythms than an early bird who wants to get up and get going early. So this myth that early is better and we should get up and get going, and that somehow is more morally acceptable, really is a myth we shouldn't follow.
Yeah, and I guess if you look at humans from an evolutionary perspective, is that everybody's different and differences should be celebrated. But obviously the system of how society is set up is we all have to kind of fit into a very similar mold, when in reality that is not how we reflected in it.
That's correct. And so when I was working at the Division of Sleep Medicine, I would try and not to have a meeting before 10 o'clock in the morning, because I would like to sleep in a little bit and more of an evening type. The other good thing about that, though, of course, is I could never be late for work, because if anyone ever complained, I just would say, well, I'm sleeping, and couldn't complain about that in the Division of Sleep Medicine.
Yeah.
So flexibility is good, and sort of after COVID and the idea that we could maybe work at home a little bit more or have more flexibility in our work hours, that's a good thing. So people can arrange their schedules a little bit more sensitively to their circadian and sleep rhythm.
Yeah, that's a positive outcome of that. So going on to the effects of sleep on mental health, why is it so important for mental health? Talking from a personal perspective, I've said it's a massive impact on my mental health. So yeah, is there any reasons for that?
Well, it's probably to do with brain function. Sleep is really for the brain and by the brain, and so anything that the brain does, needs good sleep. And of course, mental health is brain function. And so we know, as we talked about earlier, that if you don't sleep well or try and stay awake for a long time, your brain function starts to decline quite quickly. Your cognitive abilities decline, your memory declines, your reaction times change, your ability to have insight and make connections change quite quickly. So in the lab, we measure these types of things in people, and even just over 1 or 2 days, you can start to see some of these brain functions, these cognitive functions decline quite quickly. And we're limited, obviously, ethically, how long we can keep people awake for. But if you get to sort of 3 days of wakefulness, people are performing pretty poorly. And so really your brain function is what we see go most early in a sleep deprivation study. which I think speaks to the importance of the brain and restoring and maintaining brain function, presumably through these mechanisms by which it sort of cleans out the brain each and every night. So sleep is for the brain. It is, created by the brain as well. And so brain function and sleep are, very intimately linked.
And in your book, you talk about, there's research about how people who suffer with mental health conditions such as depression and schizophrenia, they often have a lot of sleep disturbances. So in your opinion, does poor sleep cause the mental health or has a contribution towards a mental health issue, or do you think that the mental health issues cause problems with sleep?
I think that both of those are true, but there is sort of a two-way street between mental health and sleep. So often sleep will start to become problematic or deteriorate prior to maybe some of the symptoms of depression, for example. And so sleep may start to go wrong earlier in the process, and sort of be an early indicator that there may be issues, or people are not sleeping well. And then if people develop mental health problems, then sleep is one of the things that then seems to affect downstream. And so there does seem to be a two-way street. We know that if you're a poor sleeper, that might indicate a greater risk of a mental health disorder later in life. But if you develop a mental health disorder, then that also will impact your sleep. And there's probably sort of a negative feedback loop there where the poor sleep then exacerbates issues that you have. So maintaining good sleep as well as you can, we think, is a good health strategy for mental health if we think that poor sleep is a causative factor. But then in the treatment of mental health disorders, trying to make sure that people have enough time for sleep and try and get adequate sleep is also a good treatment strategy probably for most mental health disorders.
So what role does sleep play in mental health conditions, such as schizophrenia that you talk about in the book, depression? You have a stat in the book. I think it's around 77% of people who suffer with manic episodes, their lack of sleep can act as a trigger, or even, flying across time zones can also be a trigger.
Yeah, so really obviously depends on the particular disorder. There clearly with things like, bipolar disorder, that there is a rhythm to the sleep patterns which are indicative of that disorder. So there might be periods where people sleep for a very long period of time, where they may have more symptoms of depression, and then episodes where they sleep very little if they're in a manic part of their cycle. So the sleep-wake cycle, can very closely sort of indicate the depressive state. In other types of depression, sleep deprivation can be used to bring someone out of a depressive episode. And so you can keep someone awake for a longer period of time, a day or so, and they may have temporary relief of their depression. But when they sleep again, that some of the depressive symptoms come back. If you think about something like seasonal affective disorder, you start to see changes in the sleep-wake pattern prior to the depressive symptoms as the season changes, where people might then, have longer sleep episodes, struggle to wake up in the morning as winter approaches, and then that goes away again as we get into spring. Some of the studies in schizophrenia have shown that some patients living with schizophrenia have a non-24-hour rhythm, similar to the blind people, but a different type of disorder, where probably their exposure to different light-dark cycles sort of triggers this feedback that makes them live on a sort of a longer day, where they go to bed later and later and later and later, and struggle to live on a 24-hour day. So there isn't sort of a single link between sleep and depressive illness. It really sort of does depend on the disorder and how that is expressed. One thing that I think is very common, however, and is not necessarily linked to a diagnosis, but that's the link between anxiety and insomnia. Many people will report that, anxiety at work, anxiety in their relationships, stress, will cause sleep problems. Make it harder to fall asleep or make it harder to stay asleep. And so, commonly people have experienced, I'm sure, that link between a stressful episode, having some issues with mental health, and then having sleep problems associated with that. And so that is quite common and something that people should be aware of. And if you're struggling with sleep and anxiety, obviously trying to reduce that anxiety and bring in methods to reduce that anxiousness may then help sleep, which in turn may help you feel less anxious, which then may help sleep and get into a positive feedback loop rather than a negative one. Other links that we've found, if you have untreated sleep disorders, for example, sleep apnea or insomnia or shift work disorder, other sleep disorders, we also know that associates with a higher risk of symptoms of depression and anxiety as well, particularly in first responders, which is a group we've done a lot of research with: police officers, firefighters, doctors, nurses, and so on. And so having a sleep disorder seems to exacerbate some of those challenges of those jobs and the mental health challenge of those jobs. So there's lots of different links between sleep and mental health. But just sort of to summarize, if you can sleep better, you may reduce your risk of developing disorders. But if you have a disorder, then trying to focus on getting the best sleep you can with as regular schedule as you can might be helpful in reducing some of those symptoms.
Yeah, definitely. I've just been thinking about, my own personal experiences with insomnia, and I guess part of it is, you get into this feedback of feeling anxious about going to sleep. But I wouldn't necessarily say, in my case, it's not about I'm worried I'm not going to sleep. It's kind of the repercussions the next day if I haven't slept well. If you don't sleep well, then it's going to affect your performance at work, or you might have to take the day off. And I feel like that plays also a big role in the feedback into why people get so anxious about trying to sleep. Well, definitely for me anyway, that it's not necessarily being anxious about sleep, but it's the implications.
Yes, you're right. That is a common symptom as well, that people become concerned that they won't sleep and then what will happen. And there has been discussion about, whether wearable devices exacerbate that type of problem, where people sort of start to get a bit obsessed about exactly what their wearable says and what their sleep score is and how much sleep they get. So that is certainly something to be aware of. But within that, for that type of concern and for insomnia in general, it's been shown that the cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is quite a powerful tool. And in fact, there are some online and app-based tools which can help people self-guide through a CBTI program, where some of those concerns and symptoms will be addressed in, not only the anxiety that you're describing, but also just the sleep hygiene and the sleep habits and keeping a regular schedule and thinking about light. And so there is, for example, available on the NHS, an app called Sleepio, which is a CBTI app that is a self-guided program that has been shown in clinical trials to be quite successful at helping people maintain better sleep habits and better sleep for quite a long period of time, and better than, for example, hypnotics use have been shown. So, your listeners might want to look at that.
Even if I'll look at it as well.
Yeah. Helping people with disorders, everyone could probably sleep better. So just getting better sleep habits and thinking about how to prioritize sleep for all of our, mental health, something like that, I think would be quite helpful.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'll definitely check that out as well. I'm always keen to learn more about improving my sleep. I mean, I'd say I have a pretty good sleep schedule now, but you never know. Could improve it even more. So, in terms of treating, other sleep-related conditions, for example, seasonal affective disorder, I've read about that you can use light therapy for that and other circadian rhythm disorders. So, have you had any experience of using this as a form of therapy or any studies on that?
Yes, we have. The treatment, really, the standard treatment for seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, sometimes called winter depression, is light therapy. And the theory behind that is that when our seasons change and the nights get longer, then we're somehow lacking light. It probably isn't that simple, but light therapy has been shown to help patients with seasonal affective disorder and reduce their depressive symptoms. And most of the studies have looked at morning light exposure and show some success. But in fact, light exposure, we think at any time of day, is beneficial to these patients. It just tends to be that people are focused more on the morning light. And there were in the past sort of bright light boxes that you had to get and sit in front of for sort of 45 minutes, an hour in the morning. you can still buy those, and they seem to be useful. But sunlight, if available, is also good. There's plenty of light in sunlight. Obviously, the winters, as the nights get longer, that's harder and harder to do in the morning. But just, having all your indoor lights on as bright as possible in the morning and through the day. And if you wanted to buy a light box, just having something which is a focused sort of light treatment, again, just for 45 minutes in the morning, seems to help people with those seasonal symptoms. Light has also been used as a stimulant in other types of disorders, such as fatigue associated with chemotherapy. Light is a stimulant. And so disorders where fatigue or sleepiness might be a problem, light is a potential therapy for that. And again, ideally, daylight would be good at the first instance. Being by windows, being outside is good. But then bright indoor lights and potentially a light therapy box is helpful. But also thinking about your light-dark cycle. Your brain is expecting a night as well as a day in order to keep all of its rhythms in sync. And so bright days, dim evenings, and dark nights are the type of pattern you want to try and establish. And if you can have brighter, bluer looking light in the day, cooler looking lights in the day, that's better. In the evening, warmer looking firelight type lights in the evening, and then sleep in darkness, or as dark as you can make the space. So having these bright days, firelight evenings, dark nights on a regular basis should help with your sleep, your daytime alertness, your performance, but all the other things that your clock controls as well, which goes way beyond sleep and mood.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, caffeine, as we mentioned before, is widely used to counteract the effects of sleep deprivation, or I guess for performance enhancement. So, what role does it play in either helping or harming our sleep, and how should people be using it wisely?
Because caffeine is the most widely used drug in the world. It is a performance-enhancing drug. To some extent, society really relies on the impact of caffeine to stay functional. So what caffeine does is block the buildup of a neurotransmitter called adenosine, which we produce as we use energy through the day. And caffeine blocks that, so we don't feel as sleepy when using caffeine. The trouble is it does harm our sleep. So while it keeps us more alert when we're awake, it does hang around a long time and affect our sleep. So it has a fairly long half-life, which is the time it takes to get rid of half of the amount. And that can be anywhere sort of 3 to 5 hours. So even the caffeine you have at breakfast is affecting your sleep that night. And again, there'll be a lot of people who say, I can have a cup of coffee just before bed. It has no effect on me, but it would if I measured your brain activity pattern. So caffeine is certainly having an impact on nearly everyone. And in fact, you can look at the genes for caffeine sensitivity if you wanted to really get into it. So caffeine is a stimulant. It keeps you alert. If you're not getting enough sleep at night, then caffeine can help you, function and be awake in the daytime, but you surely shouldn't be using it after lunch. Because if you're using small amounts of caffeine in the morning, little and often is the trick, you have enough caffeine in your system to keep you going all the way through to bedtime. And so if you choose to use caffeine, morning only, stop it after lunch, little and often is the trick. But when we've brought people into the lab to study their sleep, we ask them to stop using caffeine for 3 weeks before they come into the lab. And they often report being more alert than when they were using caffeine. And we think this is because if you use caffeine, you don't sleep as well, so you feel tired, so you use more caffeine, so you don't sleep as well, and you go round and round. But if you break that cycle and stop using caffeine, you will take a couple of days to get over the side effects. So you will have some side effects of caffeine addiction because it is an addictive drug. So headaches, jitteriness, nausea maybe, but after a few days that should go. And then you'll find yourself probably sleeping better at night. So you're not as sleepy in the day. So you don't need the caffeine in the day. So you sleep better at night. And then you get into that positive feedback loop. So people who have broken that caffeine habit sometimes report feeling better. And again, if you're struggling with sleep, that is something you could consider, and certainly, stop using it after lunchtime.
Yeah, that's a valuable insight for our listeners. And, I've read actually that decaffeinated drinks, decaf coffee, decaf tea, aren't actually caffeine free. So if someone was trying to go completely off caffeine, could they still use these, or would that still be quite a lot of caffeine to have?
Yeah, so there is caffeine in decaffeinated drinks. It's not caffeine free, as you say, but the amounts are much, much less. So, a decaffeinated tea might have 5 milligrams or less, whereas a normal tea might be 30, 40, 50 milligrams. So it's a lot less, but it's not none. But if you were trying to bring yourself off the caffeine gradually, then that would be fine. Because as I mentioned, you will likely experience withdrawal symptoms if you just stop dead in terms of using caffeine. So if someone wants to bring themselves off it gradually, then maybe decaf for a week or so before stopping completely might make it an easier process.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that would be a better way, I think, because I've accidentally stopped having caffeine before, and I had a massive headache, and I was like, why do I have this? But yeah, it was the no caffeine. So you've had clients from Formula One to NASA astronauts, so where sleep is so important for performance. So what strategies have you developed to help them maintain sleep quality in such a demanding environment?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the fact that such elite individuals, want to understand more about sleep and its impact sort of speaks to what everyone should do. I mean, you talked earlier about the individuals who you say, I'll sleep and I'm dead. That's not been my experience of people who are elite individuals. And there's really no more elite individuals than astronauts. And so they understand how important sleep is to performance. And if you're doing something, you're going on a spacewalk or you're doing some sort of a mission on the space station, you've got to be at your best. And you need to sleep well to be at your best. The same for Formula One drivers. Their reaction times need to be absolutely as perfect as possible when driving at such speeds. So people who are working at that level get it. They get that sleep is required. And so the first thing you have to do, and this is true for all of us, is you have to prioritize sleep. You have to put enough time in your schedule to sleep. Now, people will say, well, I'm so busy. I've got this to do. I've got that to do. There is no one busier than an astronaut in terms of training times, in terms of the things they have to do. And so if astronauts can do it, anybody can. But it takes some intent to prioritize sleep. What we tend to do, what people tend to do is they schedule everything else first and then put sleep in last, and sleep gets squeezed out. We need to flip that completely. Put sleep in first, and then let everything else fit around the sleep, and then something else has to give, rather than making the sleep give. So that's sort of a first prioritization, and that's what astronauts and Formula One drivers and other elite individuals do. And then it's about, what are the environmental factors to make sure they're good. So where are you sleeping? Is it cool, quiet, comfortable? Is it dark? Do I need to change my sleep environment to get the most out of sleep? How do I tell people not to disturb me? And then if we're traveling across time zones, which both astronauts and Formula One drivers do, we put jet lag programs in place to adapt their clock as quickly as possible to make sure that they can be sleeping at the right circadian time as soon as they can, in the new time zone. So we put in place light dark strategies to shift their clocks as quickly as we can. And then we also have in those environments use light as a fatigue countermeasure. So I mentioned earlier that light is a stimulant. And so we've actually fitted new lights on the space station, which allow the astronauts to change the intensity and the spectrum of the light based on what they need to do. So just like I described having a bluer looking, cooler light in the daytime in your own home, astronauts can do that for their daytime on the space station. And then they can bring the light level down and make it dimmer and redder in the evening before sleep, just like you can do in your own home. And then they sleep in darkness and use eye masks and earplugs and so on, just like you can. Many of these strategies you can also do, but it is about prioritizing sleep time, thinking about sleep, being proactive in making sure that you treat sleep importantly and don't squeeze it out with all the other activities of the day.
So going on from that, talking about jet lag, traveling across different time zones, you've played a key role in developing an app which helps travelers manage jet lag. So can you explain how that works and how does it improve sleep for people who are constantly crossing time zones?
Yeah, so the Time Shifter app is based on work I did sort of by hand before the app was developed, where I would develop jet lag plans and shift work plans for NASA, so they could adapt their clock as quick as they can when flying, for example, from Houston to Moscow or Cologne or Tokyo to train. The astronauts needed to hit the ground running when they got there. And so you can reset the body clock a little quicker if you use the right timing of light and dark. So if you just do your own thing, the body clock will shift about an hour every day. So if you're traveling from, London to New York, which is a 5-hour time zone difference, it'll take you about 5 days to adapt to New York time on the way there, and then about 5 days to adapt on the way back. But if you put together a plan where you expose individuals to light and dark at a better circadian time, and then also support that with things like when to nap and when to sleep, how to use caffeine, and sometimes how to use melatonin to help shift the clock, then you can shift the clock more quickly, maybe by about 3 hours a day. So rather than take 5 days to adapt to New York time, you'd be adapted in about a day and a half. And in fact, what the app does is start to adapt you before you leave. So you adapt by an hour or two before you go. So in fact, in that particular example, you can be adapted to New York time, a day after arriving and enjoy your holiday or make sure your business meeting is successful. So it's really taking circadian principles of how to time light and dark. That's the most important component. And then how to support that to shift the body clock as quickly as possible to the new time zone. And we take a similar approach with shift work and helping people adapt to different shift patterns. Again, light and dark being the most important component, but then supported with things like naps and caffeine and so on. So it's really taking the basic science and putting it into a format that people can follow themselves, and has so far been quite successful, we think.
Yeah, it's really interesting. My mum's actually used the app when she went to Canada, and she said it helps. So there you go. Yeah, and you've also been working on an app for shift workers as well. Is that right?
That's right. So that's in the final stages of testing and should be released fairly soon. And that again will be available just like the jet lag one is, just on the App Store. Mm-hmm. And we're giving people a free trial. You can just try it for free. Same with the jet lag. Give it a go, see if you think it helps you, and then we can set up something after that.
What's the name of the app?
That's again Time Shifter, but for shift work. So there's the Time Shifter jet lag app, and then Time Shifter shift work app. And they're both on the same website.
Yeah, after reading your book, I have a friend who's a doctor and she works shift work patterns. She really struggles to get good sleep, and in such a job such as a doctor, you kind of need to be performing at a high level. And I told her, wear sunglasses, I guess, when she's getting ready to go to sleep, and actually got some melatonin tablets. And she messaged me and said, she slept 8 hours before a shift when she was starting at 8 p.m. So, I guess that really does have some positive outcomes.
Yeah, I think, people sometimes develop their own strategies, but we try and make sure that they're based in good science. When we come to shift work, I know that's not a main focus, but there are good and bad ways to organize shift patterns, and we've done a lot of work on understanding that. But regardless of what shift pattern you're given, there are, again, good and bad ways to try and manage that. And so very, very quickly, if you are working at night and trying to sleep in the day, going to bed as soon as you can after work finishes is important, because the longer you wait, it's harder to fall asleep. Using caffeine little and often, but stopping sort of about halfway through your shift at night to try and minimize that impact on daytime sleep. And something that's really important for night shift work, especially the first night of a sequence of night shifts, is to have a nap before coming to work. So most people might, get up at their normal time or a little bit later, but they'll stay awake for most of the day, then go to work at night. And so you've been awake for a long time when you hit that circadian dip, at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. So getting a nap before that night shift is really important. And then between night shifts, you come home, sleep as long as you can, but it's rare that you would sleep, a full 8 hours. And so then even having a short nap before coming back for the second or third night shift is really important. And the more people can can do that, they'll find, I think, that they're more alert at work overnight and be performing better.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd just like to throw in a little tip because I've had many issues with sleep, but one thing that I do quite often is progressive muscle relaxation, which I think I've read somewhere is something that pilots did or do to help them sleep because it's really important for them. You go through, you tense up different regions of your body, then relax, and it's just, for me, it's a helpful way to help me get to sleep.
Yeah, I think anything that relaxes you, and there are other strategies as well that you could try. It's important to break up the day from the night. You want to do something in between the daytime and sleep. So relaxation techniques, as you just mentioned, breathing exercises have been shown to be good. Meditation, even yoga. Sometimes having a warm bath or a warm shower will also help relax you and help you lose heat as you fall asleep, which you need to do. Reading a book, an old-fashioned book with a dim bedside lamp, not your devices, is good. A warm, non-caffeinated drink could also be helpful, again, with that temperature regulation. Listening to music, something calming. So anything that is calm and helpful and relaxing, you can find and to split that day up. But in dim light, and making sure we stop using those devices as long as we can before sleep, because they are more and more of a concern in terms of poor sleep issues.
Yeah, definitely. So we've talked a bit about society and the role that has to play with sleep. So what changes on a societal level what do you believe is necessary to prioritize sleep and promote healthy sleeping habits across the whole population?
Well, we could turn the internet off at 10 o'clock every night.
Yeah.
That would do it. It wasn't that long ago that the BBC stopped its broadcast and we all went to bed. That was only at the end of the 90s. And so the fact that we've now got 24/7 news, 24/7 supermarkets, 24/7 libraries, garages, we don't need all these 24/7 things. And all they do is damage our ability to sleep. And so, institutions have, I think, some responsibility in changing that. And again, it wouldn't be the end of the world if we went back to some of those things that switched off overnight. In the workplace, we talked a little bit about earlier, having more flexi time to allow people to manage their work schedules with their circadian rhythms. And so I think flexi time in the workplace is a good thing. Certainly later school start times for teenagers is something we need to keep pushing for. There is nothing else where you can literally change the educational attainment of every child overnight than a later school start time. It's actually cost neutral and really has had an amazing impact when it's been done both in the UK, Europe, and the US. There's no need not to do it. There's no reason not to do it. So I think that's a strong institutional change we should make. And thinking more and more about sleep. The epidemiology of sleep is a little bit behind diet and exercise. The diet and exercise research has been telling us for a lot longer about the importance of those, and we sort of all know that. The sleep field is catching up a bit, and I don't think people quite understand yet the importance of sleep. It may be even more important than diet and exercise in terms of long-term health. Every major chronic disorder has been linked to sleep to some degree. So more education of the public, more education of professionals, prioritizing our sleep and not burning the candle at both ends, I think is key. And then, thinking of other places, more sleep-friendly environments in hospitals to help people recover.
Definitely.
Thinking about how sleep and drink driving and drug driving interact. There may be rules that could be developed to reduce the risk of those. There are even discussions in the future about having a driving test for sleepiness, much like you can now test for alcohol. You may be able to test for how sleepy you are from a blood test or a breath test. And maybe if you're too sleepy, you shouldn't be able to drive, just like we stop people from driving if they've had too much alcohol. So, there are more of these pushes into the future about how we might monitor sleep and sleepiness, but, look at your own lives and prioritize individually, first of all. And then there is, these institutional changes we can also keep pushing for.
Yeah, definitely. And, one little excerpt from your book and studies on sleep and its impact on road traffic accidents, for example, I think you say that when the clocks go forward, people are getting an hour less in bed. I think it's around 20% increase in road traffic accidents. Is that right?
That's right. On that first Monday morning after we lose an hour. So, and people will say, well, I lose an hour here and there, I have a bigger change. But the fact that everyone in society on one day systematically loses an hour's sleep, that does seem to increase that risk. And so I think that's a good example of even fairly small changes can have an impact on our health and safety. Imagine if you are a short sleeper, doing it night after night after night for months or even years, you can see how that accumulates over time. And so you're trying to stop that cycle, doing the best you can to get more sleep has got to be better for you long-term in terms of long-term health.
Yeah. And, reflecting on your book, and it was published a few years ago now, but you told me that you're having an upcoming revision. Is there any major new changes or insights in that?
So the second edition, that might have been a secret. No, I'm only kidding.
Okay.
Professor Foster and I are working on a second edition. So yes, that's about 12 years now since the first one. So yes, there's been lots of advances since then in terms of understanding how sleep works to clean the brain out, as we talked about, what one of its functions are. But also, sadly, more examples of how poor sleep has had negative impacts on health, which we'll cover as well. And I think device use is part of that. In the past decade or so, device use has increased dramatically. It's probably true to say that sort of light pollution has continued to increase at night. And we've seen sort of a parallel increase in mental health problems in that time, particularly in teenagers. And we do think that sleep, circadian disorders, inappropriate light exposure interacts with device use and the things that devices deliver to people in addition to the light. And so, that sort of increased impact of modern society is something that we will cover, as well as some of the newer understandings of what sleep is and how you measure it, and then sort of neurochemistry of sleep. There's been lots of advances on that in the past 10 years.
Okay. So when is that coming out?
I don't know exactly. We're scheduled to complete it sometime next year, but I don't know what the launch date is.
Okay, I'll definitely be reading it. It's super interesting, and I'll be posting the book in the description. You can learn so much more that we couldn't cover in this episode. So I'll ask you one more question, which is for our listeners who may be facing challenges with sleep and mental health issues, could you share some practical steps that they can take to improve their sleep quality?
Yeah, so it really is a summary of many of the things we've already talked about. First of all, prioritizing sleep. If you're not giving yourself enough time for sleep, that's step one. Try and put sleep in the calendar first and put everything around that. Look at your device use and light exposure in the evening. That's a common concern where people are using their phones too close to bedtime and have too much bright light exposure in the evening. So look at that. Try and keep as regular a schedule as possible. I know that's difficult, again, sometimes with work schedules and all the things we have to do, but maintain as regular a pattern as possible. If you can get a bit of extra sleep at weekends, sleep in. If you can, there's no bad thing in that. Try and get a little bit of extra sleep. And if you are struggling with sleep, look at, for example, one of those solutions we talked about, the cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia app, the Sleepio app. That can be quite a useful tool, but also think about your general sort of sleep hygiene, the regularity of sleep, the noise, the light, the temperature of the room. Make sure your sleeping environment is as comfortable as it can be. And then if you do all those things and you're still having concerns with sleep, still having issues, then of course speak to your doctor about this. Sleep disorders are serious. They need to be treated. And so after you've tried some of these sort of solutions you can do at home, if that doesn't solve it, do talk to your healthcare practitioners about your sleep problems.
Great. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Stephen. Your insights have been really, really valuable, and I'm sure our listeners will find them fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Your Head in Mind podcast. I hope today's conversation with Dr. Stephen Lockley brought new insights into the powerful impact of sleep on our mental and physical well-being. Remember, sleep is essential for cognitive function emotional health, and overall resilience, and small changes can make a big difference. If you're looking to improve your sleep or simply better understand its role in mental health, take inspiration from today's practical tips and expert insights. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who may benefit from these insights. You can also follow us on social media, visit our website to stay updated on upcoming episodes as we continue to dive into all things mental health from every angle. For more information on Dr. Lockley's work and resources mentioned today, check the episode description. I'm Kyle, and until next time, take care and keep your head in mind.